the story of the world begins with the fatting of the fire and the darkening of the sun. In the land of Lothric, where the high walls touch the clouds and the ancient stone smells of damp moss and cold ash, the Age of Light is reaching its final, flickering breath. The atmosphere here is gray, heavy, and filled with a deep sense of waiting. The ground beneath the feet of the lost is a path of gray dust and broken bricks, a road that has seen the passage of kings and the fall of gods. The air tastes of soot, dry bone, and the metallic scent of old armor. The sound of the world is a low and constant rhythmic moan of the wind moving through the empty towers, making the entire kingdom feel like a colossal stone tomb. This part of the history is a story of the deep chill, a realization that the first flame, the source of all life and heat, is almost cold. As the fire dies, the world begins to warp and fold in on itself. The lands of ancient lords are being pulled toward the base of the high wall, creating a tangled mess of different times and places. This is the era of the convergence, where the atmosphere is one of unstable footing and the smell of the rot. You see the way the buildings lean against each other like tired giants, their foundations crumbling into the abyss. This part of the history is a story of the sinking world, a realization that the order of the gods is breaking apart. The sound of the distant bells ringing across the fog is a sharp and piercing note, a noise that signals the awakening of those who were meant to save the fire. The unkindled, those who tried to link the fire once before and failed, are rising from their graves in the cemetery of ash. They move with a sturdy and measured might, their armor clinking in the stillness, feeling the steady heat of the lingering embers and the raw weight of a duty they never asked for. Deep within the cemetery, the atmosphere becomes cramped, cold, and lethal. The unkindled find themselves facing a massive guardian named Yhorm, a warrior of stone and steel who tests those who wish to enter the shrine. This is the trial of the judge, where the atmosphere is one of whistling blades and the spray of gray dust. The warriors find that the guardian is not just a man, but a vessel for a dark and oily corruption that bursts from his back like a black serpent. The sound of the metal hitting the stone is a sharp and ringing snap, making the small arena feel like the inside of a drum. This part of the history is a realization that the darkness is no longer just a shadow, but a living, hungry force. The unkindled feel the steady pulse in their wrists and the constant pressure of the cold against their skin, a feeling of total and grounded focus as they pull the coiled sword from the guardian's chest to begin their journey. At the center of the Firelink Shrine, the survivors find a small group of people who have waited for centuries in the dark. The atmosphere is intimate, warm with the light of a tiny hearth, and resolute. This is the story of the last gathering, where the atmosphere is one of hushed voices and the smell of burning wood. You see the firekeeper, her eyes covered by a silver crown, waiting to guide the souls of the powerful into the dying flame. This part of the history is a realization that the 5 thrones of the lords are empty. The lords of Cinder The great heroes who linked the fire in the past have refused to return to their seats to sacrifice themselves again. The sound of the fire crackling in the pit is a low and musical note, making the shrine feel like a fragile island in a sea of black. The unkindled must now hunt down these lords and bring their cinders back to the thrones, even if they have to do it by force. Leaving the shrine and heading toward the high wall of Lothric, the journey leads to a view of a world that has forgotten the sun. The sky is a bruised purple and orange, with a dark circle where the sun used to be, leaking black dregs into the clouds. The atmosphere is vast, quiet, and terrifying, a realization that the time for words has passed. This part of the history is a story of the Hallowed Kingdom, where the atmosphere is one of leaden feet and the taste of ash. You see the way the knights of the city stand like statues, their minds gone and their bodies nothing but dry husks. The air is cold and carries the taste of salt and the heavy scent of the dead. The sound of the dragons screaming from the battlements is a deep and final roar, signaling that the defense of the city has turned into a funeral march. The walk through the high battlements is a story of a long and lonely struggle. The unkindled move past the bodies of those who prayed to the sun until they turned to stone. This is a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere is somber and very still, a realization that the kingdom of Lothric was built on a promise that the fire would never go out. This part of the history is a story of the failed legacy, where the tradition of the knights met the reality of the darkness. The sound of the boots on the stone is a dull and respectful thud, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that is becoming weightless. They move with a sturdy and measured power, realizing that the way of the flame is now a path of the grave. Deep in the heart of the city, the final trial of the first part takes place as the unkindled reach the grand gate leading to the settlement below. The atmosphere is intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the journey is only just beginning. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared quest, where they look out over the tangled lands and realize the scale of the task. The conversation is silent, held between the warrior and the wind. The sound of the banner flapping in the storm is a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy is the apathy of the lords who have given up on the world. They carry the coiled sword and the flask of fire, moving toward the edge of the wall to see what remains of the land of the gods. The experience at the high wall ends with the unkindled looking toward the distant woods and the ruined cathedrals on the horizon. The gold of the old age has led to a sovereignty of the gray mist. They carry the weight of the failed link and the silence of the empty thrones. The atmosphere is one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash is now a path of the Kingslayer. The focus would now shift to the undead settlement and the road of sacrifices, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the rot into a world of hollowed villagers, giant crabs, and the realization that the world is being consumed from the inside out. The final legacy of the first part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the awakening. You have seen the ash rise and find the purpose within the cold shrine. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the judge. As the orange glow of the dying sun fades into the evening shadows of the towers, and the first dark fog reaches the battlements, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the unkindled finds its first resolution in the reaching of the wall, leaving behind the world of the grave for a world of the city, the stone, and a journey that was becoming a long walk toward the end of time. The descent from the high wall led the unkindled into the sprawling, decaying remains of the undead settlement. The air here was no longer the thin, cold mist of the battlements, but a thick and stagnant soup of damp wood, wet earth, and the sweet scent of rotting fruit. This was a place where the people had long ago lost their minds, turning into hollowed husks that spent their days performing strange and meaningless tasks. The atmosphere was heavy, crowded, and filled with a quiet madness. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of soft, black mud and broken timber, a road that wound through narrow alleys and over sagging bridges. The air tasted of wood smoke and the dry, powdery scent of old bones. The sound of the world was a low and constant murmur, the sound of hollowed villagers whispering to themselves, and the distant tolling of a bell that no longer had a purpose. This part of the history is a story of the common grave, a realization that the kingdom of Lothric was rotting from the bottom up. As the unkindled moved through the streets, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and erratic danger. They found villagers who would stop their work to attack with pitchforks and heavy saws, their movements jerky and unpredictable like broken dolls. This was the era of the cursed village, where the atmosphere was one of flickering torchlight and the shadows of the hanging dead. You see the way the bodies were packed into cages and hung from the trees, a desperate and failed attempt to keep the curse of undeath from spreading. This part of the history is a story of the purging of the flesh, a realization that even in death, there was no peace for the people of this land. The sound of a heavy cleaver hitting a wooden table was a sharp and echoing snap, a noise that signaled the presence of the massive evangelists who led the villagers in their dark rituals. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their shield held high against the rain of firebombs, feeling the steady heat of the torches and the raw weight of the suffering all around them. Deep within a courtyard at the center of the settlement, the atmosphere became cramped and terrifyingly biological. The unkindled found a massive, ancient tree known as the Great Wood, its trunk bulging with the weight of 1,000 curses. This was the trial of the living rot, where the atmosphere was one of splashing sap and the crushing weight of branches. The warriors found that the tree was not just wood, but a container for the filth and the prayers of the desperate villagers. The sound of the wood cracking as the giant moved was a deep and grating roar, making the courtyard feel like the inside of a breaking ribcage. This part of the history is a realization that the land was trying to store its sickness in anything that would hold it. The unkindled had to strike at the weak points of the trunk, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the falling limbs, a feeling of total and grounded focus as the ground finally gave way and dropped them into the dark pits below. Leaving the broken remains of the tree behind, the journey led toward the road of sacrifices, a path that stretched through a damp and foggy forest. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and deceptively soft, a realization that the world was becoming more wild and less human. This part of the history is a story of the long walk to the cathedral, where the atmosphere is one of soft moss and the smell of stagnant water. You see the way the trees were draped in thick gray webs, and the path was guarded by men who had grown feathers and wings, turning into vermin of the air. The air was cool and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of the swamps. The sound of the giant crabs moving through the shallow water was a sharp and scraping note, signaling that the natural world was reclaiming the ruins of the gods. The walk through the forest was a story of a vanishing humanity. The unkindled moved past ruined stone pillars and old bridges that led nowhere. This is a moment of raw and natural reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the road of sacrifices was exactly what its name implied, a path for those being sent to feed the hunger of a lord. This part of the history is a story of the predator and the prey, where the tradition of the journey met the reality of the hunt. The sound of the boots on the wet earth was a dull and respectful thud, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that was becoming a green and sunken dream. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their eyes fixed on the distant towers of a fortress, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the mud. Deep in the heart of the forest, the final trial of the second part took place as the unkindled reached a ruined structure guarded by the crystal sage. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the magic of the old world was still being used to guard the way. This is a story of the sovereignty of the blue light, where the air was filled with the hiss of spells and the shattering of glass. The warriors found that the sage could split into many forms, filling the woods with fake shadows and blinding flashes. The sound of the crystal spears hitting the stone was a sharp and ringing snap, signaling that the true enemy was the knowledge that had been twisted by the dark. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his blade cutting through the illusions, realizing that the only way forward was to break the mind of the gatekeeper. The experience at the road of sacrifices ends with the unkindled standing at the edge of a great cliff, looking down into a deep and sunken cathedral and a massive, poisonous swamp. The green of the woods had led to a sovereignty of the black water. They carried the weight of the Greatwood's curse and the silence of the forest. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path of the deep. the focus would now shift to the Cathedral of the Deep and the Farron Keep, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the sludge into a world of infinite graves, dark watchers, and the realization that the First Lord was close. The final legacy of the second part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the rotting world. You have seen the ash move through the village and find the sickness within the wood. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the mud. As the gray glow of the afternoon sun faded into the shadows of the forest and the first mists of the swamp reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the unkindled finds its second and grounded resolution in the crossing of the forest, leaving behind the world of the village for a world of the swamp, the stone, and a journey that was becoming a deep dive into the history of the Lords. The journey led the unkindled away from the damp woods and toward the massive, soaring stone walls of the Cathedral of the Deep. This place was a monolithic fortress of faith, a structure so large it seemed to swallow the sky. The air here was no longer the scent of the forest, but a heavy and choking perfume of incense, old wax, and cold marble. This was the home of the Church of the Deep, a place where the holy had become the hollow, and the prayers had turned into a hunger for the dark. The atmosphere was quiet, grand, and terribly ancient. The ground beneath the boots was a path of white stone and gray slate, worn smooth by the feet of 1,000,000 pilgrims who never returned home. The sound of the world was a low and constant echo, the sound of heavy iron doors groaning, and the distant, rhythmic chanting of the priests. This part of the history is a story of the sunken faith, a realization that the pillars of the world were now holding up a house of monsters. As the unkindled climbed the outer rafters and moved through the high balconies, the atmosphere shifted to one of dizzying and vertical danger. They found themselves walking on narrow strips of stone hundreds of feet above the floor, where the wind whipped at their cloaks, and the gargoyles watched with eyes of cold stone. This was the era of the cathedral's shadow, where the atmosphere was one of held breaths and the smell of high altitudes. You see the way the graveyard outside was filled with an infinite sea of headstones, each one representing a body that refused to stay in the ground. This part of the history is a story of the undying guard, a realization that the cathedral was not a place of rest, but a larder for the things that lived in the dark. The sound of a crow's cry was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the stone roof like a warning. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their hands gripping the stone as they looked down into the gleaming gold and dark sludge of the altar below, feeling the steady cold of the night and the raw weight of the silence. Deep within the heart of the main hall, the atmosphere became cramped, warm, and filled with a crowding presence. The unkindled found the deacons of the deep, a massive and rhythmic ocean of priests who stood before the empty coffin of their master, Aldrich. This was the trial of the collective soul, where the atmosphere was one of flickering red light and the chant of the dead. The warriors found that they were not fighting one man, but a single mind made of 1,000 bodies. The sound of the red magic hitting the shields was a sharp and ringing snap, making the hall feel like the inside of a burning bell. This part of the history is a realization that the Lord they sought, Aldrich, the Saint of the Deep, had already left his home to travel to the city of the gods. The unkindled had to cut through the sea of robes, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the crowd against their chest. A feeling of total and grounded focus as they took the small doll needed to enter the frozen city of the future. Leaving the cathedral behind, the journey led back down the mountain and into the black and poisonous waters of Farron Keep. The atmosphere was vast, toxic, and suffocating, a realization that the land was dying a second death. This part of the history is a story of the sunken watchers, where the atmosphere is one of bubbling mud and the smell of old iron. You see the way the trees were drowned in the sludge, and the sky was a bruised and sickly green. The air was hot and carried the taste of sulfur and the heavy scent of decay. The sound of the swamp gas escaping the mud was a low and constant hiss, signaling that the abyss was no longer a story, but a physical weight on the world. The walk through the swamp was a story of a forgotten duty. The unkindled moved past 3 ancient stone altars, lighting the fires of the old code to open the great gate. This is a moment of raw and industrial reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the Abyss Watchers, the first of the Lords of Cinder, were waiting behind those doors. This part of the history is a story of the eternal duel, where the tradition of the wolf met the reality of the corruption. The sound of the heavy stone doors sliding open was a deep and final boom, making the swamp feel like it was giving up its last secret. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their boots heavy with the mud, realizing that the way of the sword was now a path into the heart of the madness. Deep in the heart of the mausoleum, the final trial of the third part took place, as the unkindled found the Abyss Watchers locked in a constant and tragic battle with themselves. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the Lords had been consumed by the very thing they were sworn to destroy. This is a story of the sovereignty of the Red Eye, where the air was filled with the clash of steel and the spray of embers. The warriors found that the Watchers were stuck in a cycle of killing their own brothers to keep the abyss from spreading. The sound of the heavy swords hitting the floor was a sharp and echoing snap, signaling that the true enemy was the tragedy of a duty that had no end. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his blade meeting the flames of the Legion, realizing that the only way to link the fire was to put his brothers to rest. The experience at the keep ends with the unkindled standing over the cinders of the First Lord, the first great victory of the Ash. The green of the swamp had led to a sovereignty of the black catacombs, hidden beneath the floor. They carried the weight of the wolf's blood and the silence of the Legion. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the Darkstone. The focus would now shift to the catacombs of Karthus and the smoldering lake, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the bones into a world of infinite skeletons, hidden sandworms, and the realization that the High King was waiting. The final legacy of the third part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the fallen duty. You have seen the ash break the faith of the cathedral and the will of the watchers. You have felt the sting of the poison and the weight of the sword. As the gray glow of the swamp sun faded into the shadows of the tomb, and the first cold air of the catacombs reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the unkindled finds its third and grounded resolution in the fall of the Legion, leaving behind the world of the water for a world of the bone, the dust, and a journey that was becoming a deep descent into the graves of the forgotten. The descent into the catacombs of Karthus was a journey from the world of the living into a kingdom made entirely of bleached bone, ancient dust, and cold stone. The air here was no longer thick with the rot of the swamp, but was dry, sharp, and filled with the scent of old burial wrappings. This was the final resting place of the warriors of Karthus, a desert people who had once conquered the sands, but were now trapped in a stony and eternal slumber. The atmosphere was quiet, heavy, and suffocatingly still. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of fine gray sand, and the splintered remains of 1,000 skeletons that crunched with every step. The sound of the world was a low and constant echo, the sound of shifting bones, and the distant, rhythmic ticking of ancient traps waiting to snap. This part of the history is a story of the sunken sand, a realization that even the greatest conquerors eventually become nothing but a memory in the dark. As the unkindled moved through the winding halls, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and kinetic danger. They found skeletons that would reassemble themselves from piles of dust, their movements sharp and metallic as they wielded curved blades of blackened iron. This was the era of the Karthus grave, where the atmosphere was one of rolling boulders and the whistle of hidden daggers. You see the way the walls were lined with the skulls of the defeated, a grim and silent record of the kingdom's power. This part of the history is a story of the undying sands, a realization that the warriors of the desert refused to let go of their weapons, even in death. The sound of a heavy stone ball rolling down a staircase was a deep and grating roar, a noise that signaled the presence of the traps left behind to guard the dead. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their shield held high against the rain of bone arrows, feeling the steady cold of the tomb and the raw weight of the silence. Deep within a massive, dark chamber at the end of the catacombs, the atmosphere became cramped and filled with a colossal presence. The unkindled found a silver cup on an altar, and upon touching it, they were pulled into a void of pure shadow where High Lord Walnir waited. This was the trial of the Abyssal King, where the atmosphere was one of shifting mists and the glow of gold. the warriors found that the king was a massive, skeletal giant who crawled through the dark, his body adorned with shining shackles and holy rings. The sound of his breath was a deep and final hiss, making the void feel like the inside of a lung made of smoke. This part of the history is a realization that even kings are afraid of the dark, as Walnir clung to his gold to keep from being swallowed by the abyss. The unkindled had to strike at the glowing bracelets, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the dark fog, a feeling of total and grounded focus. As the king was finally dragged down into the blackness, leaving the tomb behind, the journey led across a long and fragile rope bridge that hung over a massive drop into the smoldering lake. The atmosphere was vast, hot, and lethal, a realization that the world was still burning deep underground. This part of the history is a story of the fatting flame of chaos, where the atmosphere is one of orange light and the smell of sulfur. You see the way the lake was filled with the ruins of an ancient city and the massive, petrified carcasses of demons. The air was hot and carried the taste of ash and the heavy scent of old fire. The sound of the massive ballista firing from the heights was a sharp and piercing note, signaling that the defenses of the deep were still active. The walk through the smoldering lake was a story of a dying race. The unkindled moved past the bodies of the last demons, their skin turned to stone, and their fires long since extinguished. This is a moment of raw and industrial reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the chaos flame was almost gone. This part of the history is a story of the extinguished embers, where the tradition of the demon met the reality of the fatting world. The sound of the old Demon King's club hitting the ground was a dull and respectful thud, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that was turning to ash and dust. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their boots splashing through the shallow, hot water, realizing that the way of the flame was now a path through a graveyard of giants. Deep in the heart of the ruins, the final trial of the fourth part took place, as the unkindled found the path back to the surface. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the true target was still ahead. This is a story of the sovereignty of the silver light, where the air began to feel fresh and filled with the scent of winter. The warriors found that the exit from the catacombs led to a cliff overlooking a city of blue moon and sparkling ice. The sound of the wind moving over the frozen valley was a sharp and musical note, signaling that the long dark was finally being replaced by a gleaming winter. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes fixed on the towers of Irithyll, realizing that the only way to the Lords was to cross the bridge into the cold. The experience at the catacombs ends with the unkindled standing at the edge of the Boreal Valley, looking toward the grand Cathedral of the Moon and the massive, frozen walls of the city. The gold of the king had led to a sovereignty of the blue shadow. They carried the weight of the king's shackles and the silence of the lake, The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the boreal frost. The focus would now shift to the Irithyll of the Boreal Valley and the Pontiff Sulivan, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the ice into a world of ghostly nights, moonlit streets, and the realization that the Pontiff was the true jailer of the gods. The final legacy of the fourth part of the Fatting is a story of the strength in the conquered grave. You have seen the ash break the will of Walnir and the fire of the lake. You have felt the sting of the sand and the weight of the bone. As the orange glow of the underground fire faded into the shadows of the exit, and the first white light of the moon reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the unkindled finds its fourth and grounded resolution in the reaching of the valley, leaving behind the world of the dust for a world of the ice, the moon, and a journey that was becoming a cold ascent into the heavens of the Boreal King. The crossing of the bridge into Irithyll of the Boreal Valley was a transition from the world of dry dust into a kingdom of infinite winter, pale moonlight, and silver ice. The air here was no longer filled with the scent of old bone, but was crisp, sharp, and carried the taste of frozen water. This was the City of the Moon, a place where the stars seemed to hang low over the spires, and the shadows were as deep as the sea. The atmosphere was quiet, ethereal, and lethally beautiful. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of polished white marble and a thin layer of sparkling frost that shimmered under the blue sky. The sound of the world was a low and constant whistle, the sound of the wind moving through the frozen arches and the distant, rhythmic footsteps of the ghostly knights. This part of the history is a story of the silver cage, a realization that the beauty of the city was a mask for a place of absolute imprisonment. As the unkindled stepped onto the long stone bridge, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and savage violence. A massive creature known as Sulivan's Beast materialized from the thin air, its body a nightmare of fur, teeth, and sunken eyes. This was the era of the Pontiff's Guard, where the atmosphere was one of splintering ice and the snap of jaws. You see the way the creature moved with a hectic and brutal speed, its ribcage open like a hungry mouth. This part of the history is a story of the watchdog of the valley, a realization that none were permitted to enter the city without the small doll from the cathedral. The sound of the beast's roar was a deep and grating shriek, a noise that echoed across the valley like a hammer hitting a bell. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their blade cutting through the thick hide of the monster, feeling the steady cold of the spray and the raw weight of the struggle. As they pushed toward the city gates, deep within the streets of Irithyll, the atmosphere became cramped, elegant, and filled with ghostly echoes. The unkindled found the Pontiff Knights, tall and slender warriors who moved with a graceful but deadly fluidity. This was the trial of the Silver Blade, where the atmosphere was one of blue magic and the hiss of cold steel. The warriors found that the knights were no longer human, but hollowed spirits bound to the will of the Pontiff. The sound of the magic swords hitting the shields was a sharp and ringing snap, making the narrow alleys feel like the inside of a crystal box. This part of the history is a realization that the pontiff, Sullivan, had seized control of the city and turned its people into tools of his ambition. The unkindled had to move through the moonlit plazas, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the frost against their skin, a feeling of total and grounded focus as they climbed toward the great cathedral. Leaving the lower streets behind, the journey led toward a dark and sunken manor known as the Distant Manor. The atmosphere was vast, somber, and heavy with dampness, a realization that the city was built over a bottomless lake. This part of the history is a story of the sunken reach, where the atmosphere is one of black water and the smell of wet hair. You see the way the spider-like creatures crawled through the shadows of the sewers, their many limbs moving with a sickening and rhythmic click. The air was cold and carried the taste of stagnant water and the heavy scent of decay. The sound of the water lapping against the stone walls was a low and constant moan, signaling that the deep was rising even here in the city of the moon. The walk through the manor and toward the Irithyll dungeon was a story of a lost nobility. The unkindled moved past paintings of old lords and silver sets that had long since lost their shine. This is a moment of raw and architectural reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the Boreal Valley was a place where the old world came to die in silence. This part of the history is a story of the prison of the gods, where the tradition of the royalty met the reality of the dungeon. The sound of the heavy iron keys rattling in the dark was a sharp and piercing note, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that was locked away from the light. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their eyes fixed on the distant, glowing lanterns of the jailers, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the iron and the stone. Deep in the heart of the grand cathedral, the final trial of the fifth part took place as the unkindled faced Pontiff Sullivan himself. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the true jailer was finally standing before them. This is a story of the sovereignty of the dual blades, where the air was filled with the roar of fire and the hiss of magic. The warriors found that the pontiff could summon a shadowy twin to fight by his side, doubling the speed of the assault. The sound of the great sword of judgment hitting the floor was a sharp and echoing snap, signaling that the true enemy was the ambition of a man who wanted to replace the gods. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his blade meeting the flames of the pontiff, realizing that the only way to reach the gods was to break the man who had chained them. The experience at the cathedral ends with the unkindled standing over the body of the pontiff, the great gate to the upper city finally open. The blue of the moonlight had led to a sovereignty of the dark sun, hanging over the peaks of Anor Londo. They carried the weight of the pontiff's ambition and the silence of the Boreal Valley. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the city of the gods. The focus would now shift to the Anor Londo and the cannibal lord Aldrich, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the sludge into a world of ancient cathedrals, giant blacksmiths, and the realization that the gods were being eaten. The final legacy of the fifth part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the frozen city. You have seen the ash break the will of Sulivan and the ice of the valley. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the silver. As the blue glow of the moon faded into the shadows of the upper city, and the first dark mists of the cathedral reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the unkindled finds its fifth and grounded resolution in the fall of the pontiff, leaving behind the world of the ice for a world of the gods, the dark, and a journey that was becoming a sacred ascent into the heart of the devourer. The climb toward the ancient city of Anor Londo was a journey from the frozen beauty of the valley into a world of stagnant shadows, black sludge, and silent stone. The air here was no longer crisp with the scent of winter, but was heavy, thick, and carried the taste of rotting silk. This was the legendary home of the gods, a place of golden towers and vast cathedrals that once represented the height of the Age of Fire. The atmosphere was quiet, mournful, and filled with a sense of violation. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of ancient marble that was now covered in a sickening, oily black film that seemed to move on its own. The sound of the world was a low and constant echo, the sound of the wind moving through empty halls and the rhythmic clank of silver armor in the distance. This part of the history is a story of the devoured kingdom, a realization that the gods were no longer in power, and their home had become a dining hall for a monster. As the unkindled reached the high rooftops, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and precise lethality. They found the Silver Knights, the ancient guardians of the city, who still stood at their posts with great bows of polished metal. This was the era of the final guard, where the atmosphere was one of whistling arrows and the spray of stone. You see the way the massive arrows, as large as spears, struck the stone with a force that shook the rafters. This part of the history is a story of the last watch, a realization that even with their gods gone, the knights would defend the city until they turned to dust. The sound of an arrow hitting a shield was a sharp and ringing snap, a noise that signaled a fight for every inch of the walkway. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their feet finding grip on the narrow ledges, feeling the steady cold of the high air and the raw weight of the history all around them. Deep within the grand hall of the main cathedral, the atmosphere became cramped, suffocating, and filled with a deep horror. The unkindled found the Lord of Cinder, known as Aldrich, devourer of gods. This was the trial of the cannibal king, where the atmosphere was one of flickering purple light and the smell of ancient decay. The warriors found that Aldrich was no longer a man, but a massive, sludge-like ripple of darkness that had taken the form of the god he was currently eating, Gwyndolin. The sound of the magic arrows hitting the floor was a sharp and hissing note, making the vast hall feel like the inside of a waiting mouth. This part of the history is a realization that the Lord of Cinder had refused his throne because he saw a vision of a coming age of deep sea and wanted to be the strongest thing left. The Unkindled had to strike at the trail of sludge, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the dark magic. A feeling of total and grounded focus as they finally put an end to the feast, leaving the hollowed remains of Anor Londo behind. The journey led back down toward the Irithyll dungeon, a dark and sunken prison hidden beneath the city. The atmosphere was vast, claustrophobic, and heavy with pain. A realization that the pontiff had kept his enemies in a place where time stood still. This part of the history is a story of the iron and the screams, where the atmosphere is one of rattling chains and the smell of burning flesh. You see the way the jailers moved through the halls with glowing iron brands, their masks hiding faces that had forgotten how to smile. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of old blood. The sound of a cell door slamming shut was a deep and final boom, signaling that the mercy of the gods was nowhere to be found in this place. The walk through the dungeon and toward the profaned capital was a story of a lost ambition. The Unkindled moved past the wretches, creatures that had once been human, but were now twisted by experiment and fear. This is a moment of raw and industrial reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the dungeon was a factory of misery. This part of the history is a story of the downfall of the proud, where the tradition of the law met the reality of the torture. The sound of the branding iron hitting the floor was a sharp and piercing note, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that was draining the life from the living. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their eyes fixed on the distant, golden glow of a city at the bottom of the pit, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the fire and the dust. Deep in the heart of the profaned capital, the final trial of the sixth part took place as the Unkindled faced Yhorm the giant. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that another Lord of Cinder was waiting on his throne. This is a story of the sovereignty of the great machete, where the air was filled with the roar of the giant and the spray of embers. The warriors found that Yhorm was a tragic king who had sacrificed everything to save a people who hated him, only for his fire to burn them to ash. The sound of his heavy blade hitting the stone was a deep and grating thud, signaling that the true enemy was the loneliness of a ruler who had nothing left to protect. Jon moved with a sturdy and measured might, using the storm ruler sword to break the giant's guard, realizing that the only way to save the world was to fulfill a promise made to an old friend. The experience at the capital ends with the Unkindled standing over the cinders of the giant, the third lord finally brought to justice. the gold of the capital had led to a sovereignty of the cold embers falling from the ceiling. They carried the weight of the giant's sorrow and the silence of the profaned flame. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path back to the high wall. The focus would now shift to the Lothric castle and the twin princes, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the dragon into a world of gleaming armor, holy magic, and the realization that the prince refused to burn. The final legacy of the sixth part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the fulfilled vow. You have seen the ash break the hunger of Aldrich and the will of Yhorm. You have felt the sting of the branding iron and the weight of the storm. As the orange glow of the capital fire faded into the shadows of the exit, and the first cold air of the surface reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the unkindled finds its sixth and grounded resolution in the gathering of the three cinders, leaving behind the world of the depths for a world of the sky, the castle, and a journey that was becoming a final assault on the heart of the kingdom. The summoning back to the high wall of Lothric was a journey that felt like a circle closing. The air here had changed since the start of the adventure, turning from a thin mist into a heavy, suffocating pressure that smelled of burning wood and old, dry blood. The atmosphere was one of immediate and lethal urgency. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was the same gray stone as before, but it was now littered with the broken remains of the knights who had failed to hold the line. The air tasted of copper and the sharp, hot scent of a fire that was finally running out of air. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic drumming of the wind against the high banners, making the entire castle feel like a massive drum waiting for the final beat. This part of the history is a story of the sudden return, a realization that the time for the hunt was over and the time for the sacrifice had begun. Inside the small chapel where the old priestess sat, the atmosphere shifted to one of absolute and tragic finality. As she passed away, the air in the room became cold and began to swirl with a dark blue light. This was the era of the dancer's arrival, where the atmosphere was one of slow, rhythmic clinking and the smell of the frost. You see the way the dancer of the Boreal Valley descended from a portal in the ceiling, her body long, slender, and moving with a graceful but sickening fluidity. This part of the history is a story of the pontiff's final reach, a realization that the Boreal Valley had sent its most beautiful monster to guard the path to the throne. The sound of her dual blades scraping against the stone floor was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that sounded like a long, metallic hiss. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their shield held steady against the whirling storm of fire and magic, feeling the steady heat of the sparks and the raw weight of the duty they carried for the three fallen lords. Leaving the broken chapel behind, the journey led upward into the grand, gleaming heart of Lothric Castle. The atmosphere was vast, bright with the light of the dying sun and incredibly violent. This was the trial of the Dragon's Gate, where the atmosphere became one of soaring heights and the roar of the flame. The warriors found that the path was blocked by two massive dragons that breathed clouds of fire across the bridge, turning the stone into a glowing orange furnace. The sound of the dragon's breath hitting the stone was a deep and bone-shaking boom, making the bridge feel like the inside of a forge. This part of the history is a story of the kingdom's last defense, where the tradition of the dragon slayers met the reality of a world that was already half-burned. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and balanced power, finding the dark corruption at the base of the dragon's claws and cutting it away, realizing that the only way to the top was through the fire. Deep within the inner walls of the castle, the atmosphere became cramped, elegant, and filled with the sound of steel on steel. The unkindled found the Lothric knights, warriors in shining gold and red armor, who fought with a speed and power that far surpassed anything they had faced before. This was the trial of the elite guard, where the atmosphere was one of holy magic and the spray of sparks. The warriors found that the knights were being buffeted by the prayers of hidden priests, making them almost impossible to kill. The sound of the heavy swords hitting the shields was a sharp and ringing snap, making the grand hallways feel like the inside of a cathedral during a war. This part of the history is a realization that the castle was not just a home, but a fortress dedicated to a prince who refused to save the world. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his blade finding the gaps in the golden plate, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the climb. As the path led toward the grand archives, the journey became a story of the madness of the scholars. The atmosphere was one of dusty books, old wax, and the smell of ancient chemicals. This was a moment of raw and intellectual reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the men of the castle had spent their final days searching for a way to stop the fire from needing a sacrifice. This part of the history is a story of the lost knowledge, where the tradition of the book met the reality of the darkness. The sound of the ghostly hands reaching from the bookshelves was a thin and haunting note, making the library feel like a living maze. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their heads covered in wax to protect them from the curse, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the silence of the library. At the very top of the castle, on a bridge that overlooked the entire world, the final trial of the seventh part took place as the unkindled faced the Dragon Slayer armor. The atmosphere was intimate, loud, and resolute, a realization that the old spirit of the war was still alive. This is a story of the sovereignty of the empty suit, where a suit of ancient armor was being controlled by the flying monsters in the sky. The air was filled with the roar of thunder and the hiss of the wind. The warriors found that the armor fought with a brutal and mindless strength, its massive axe shield crushing the stone with every swing. The sound of the lightning hitting the floor was a sharp and echoing snap, signaling that the true enemy was the memory of a war that had never really ended. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his blade cutting through the iron and the spirit, realizing that the only way to the princes was to break the shell of the past. The experience at the castle ends with the Unkindled standing at the base of the final elevator, looking up at the twin princes' chambers. The gold of the sunset had led to a sovereignty of the deep red sky. They carried the weight of the dragon's ash and the silence of the archives. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the heart of the family. The focus would now shift to the twin princes and the final refusal of the flame, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the holy light into a world of crippled kings, teleporting shadows, and the realization that the prince would rather see the world end than burn for it. The final legacy of the seventh part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the final climb. You have seen the ash break the dancer and the armor of the old war. You have felt the sting of the fire and the weight of the castle. As the orange glow of the dying sun faded into the shadows of the high peaks, and the first dark clouds of the end reached the towers, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Unkindled finds its seventh resolution in the reaching of the summit, leaving behind the world of the wall for a world of the throne, the prince, and a journey that was becoming a final confrontation with the will of the kingdom itself. The entrance into the royal chambers at the very peak of the castle was a journey into a world of stagnant gold, heavy incense, and the silence of a dying dynasty. The air here was no longer filled with the roar of dragons, but was still warm and carried the scent of old flowers and pale magic. This was the private sanctuary of the twin princes, a place where the heir to the throne, Prince Lothric, sat in his robes and watched the world turn to ash from behind closed doors. The atmosphere was intimate, mournful, and filled with a quiet defiance. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of soft, red carpets and white marble that had been untouched by the war outside. The sound of the world was a low and constant rustle, the sound of the prince's silk robes moving against the floor, and the distant, rhythmic breathing of his brother, Lorien. This part of the history is a story of the great refusal, a realization that the kingdom's own savior had decided to let the fire fade into nothingness. As the Unkindled stepped into the center of the hall, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and heavy combat. Prince Lorien, the elder brother who had been cursed and crippled by his brother's fate, rose from the floor to defend the chamber. This was the era of the Shattered Night, where the atmosphere was one of flickering orange flame and the sudden burst of light. You see the way Lorien moved on his knees, his massive, charred greatsword dragging against the floor before erupting into a column of white-hot fire. This part of the history is a story of the bond of the brothers, a realization that Lorien had willingly taken on his brother's curse so they could be together in the dark. The The sound of the heavy sword hitting the stone was a deep and grating thud, a noise that signaled a fight against a man who had already lost everything but his love for his family. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their shield catching the edge of the flames, feeling the steady heat of the blade and the raw weight of the tragedy that had broken the royal line. Within the second stage of the battle, the atmosphere became vast, magical, and incredibly tense. Prince Lothric descended from his throne to climb onto his brother back, his slender and pale hands glowing with the light of ancient miracles. This was the trial of the twin souls, where the atmosphere was one of teleporting shadows and the hiss of holy spears. The warriors found that the brothers fought as one, moving through the air in a flash of white light to strike from the blind spots of the ash. The sound of the magic bolts hitting the floor was a sharp and ringing snap, making the grand chamber feel like the inside of a cracking mirror. This part of the history is a realization that the prince believed the linking of the fire was a curse that needed to be broken. The unkindled had to strike at both brothers at once, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the holy light, a feeling of total and grounded focus as the last of the royal line finally fell to the floor, leaving the silent chambers of the princes behind. The journey led back to the Firelink Shrine for the final ritual of the thrones. The atmosphere was somber, grave, and filled with a pale golden glow, a realization that the path to the end was finally open. This part of the history is a story of the gathering of the cinders, where the atmosphere is one of rising embers and the smell of burning soul. You see the way the firekeeper stood at the center of the shrine, her voice a soft and respectful whisper, as she began the incantation to pull the power from the 5 thrones. The air was warm and carried the taste of ash and the heavy scent of the first flame. The sound of the 5 spirits merging into one was a deep and final hum, signaling that the will of the lords was now resting on the shoulders of the unkindled. The walk toward the bonfire was a story of a sacred departure. The unkindled moved past the empty chairs of the kings they had slain to reach the flame. This is a moment of raw and existential reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the kiln of the first flame was a place outside of time and space. This part of the history is a story of the final gateway, where the tradition of the link met the reality of the fading world. The sound of the fire roaring to life in the center of the shrine was a sharp and piercing note, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that was dissolving into the gray. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their hands reaching for the sword in the fire, realizing that the way of the ash was now a path into the heart of the sun. Deep in the heart of the kiln, the final trial of the 8th part took place as the unkindled arrived at the end of the world. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that they were standing in a graveyard of empires. This is a story of the sovereignty of the ash heaps, where the air was filled with the sight of crumpled cities and broken towers. Leaning into the center of the crater, the warriors found that the land itself had been pulled together into a single point, creating a landscape of white dust and twisted iron. The sound of the wind moving over the ruins was a sharp and musical note, signaling that the age of fire had reached its final physical limit. John moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes fixed on the distant hill of ash where the first flame was guarded. Realizing that the only way to end the cycle was to face the manifestation of the fire itself. The experience at the kiln ends with the unkindled standing at the base of the final hill, looking toward the small, flickering light at the summit and the solitary figure waiting by the sword. The gold of the thrones had led to a sovereignty of the white dust. They carried the weight of the twin princes' burden and the silence of the 5 kings. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the soul of cinder. The focus would now shift to the final boss and the choice of the ending, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the ember into a world of ancient movesets, fading light, and the realization that the fire was barely more than a spark. The final legacy of the 8th part of the fading is a story of the strength in the final gathering. You have seen the ash break the will of the princes and the silence of the thrones. You have felt the sting of the holy light and the weight of the crown. As the orange glow of the shrine fire faded into the shadows of the kiln, and the first gray mists of the end reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of the unkindled finds its 8th and grounded resolution in the opening of the way, leaving behind the world of the castle for a world of the ash, the soul, and a journey that was reaching its final and eternal conclusion. The journey to the heart of the kiln of the first flame was a walk through a graveyard of time itself. The air here was thin still, and carried the dry and ancient scent of infinite ash and spent embers. This was the center of the world, where the sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the sun hung like a bleeding ring of dark fire over the horizon. The atmosphere was one of absolute and sacred finality. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a soft, white powder made of the ruins of 1,000 kingdoms that had all been pulled together into this single, jagged crater. The sound of the world was a low and constant hiss, the sound of the wind moving over the gray hills, and the distant, rhythmic crackle of the last flame. This part of the history is a story of the final vigil, a realization that everything the unkindled had done was leading to this one small patch of dirt, and the figure sitting by the sword. As the unkindled climbed the last hill of ash, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and legendary combat. The figure by the flame rose, drawing the coiled sword from the hearth as it transformed into a massive blade of fire. This was the soul of Cinder, a manifestation of every hero who had ever linked the fire, from the first lord to to the lowliest knight. This was the era of the combined soul, where the atmosphere was one of shifting stances and the spray of embers. You see the way the warrior moved, changing its style from a fast curved blade to a heavy spear, and then to a staff of blue and piercing sorcery. This part of the history is a story of the echoes of the past, a realization that the unkindled was fighting the history of the world itself. The sound of the flaming sword hitting the shield was a sharp and ringing snap, a noise that signaled a fight against the memory of the flame. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their feet sliding in the ash, feeling the steady heat of the fire and the raw weight of the ages as they fought to reach the hearth. Deep within the second stage of the battle, the atmosphere became vast, somber, and filled with a haunting melody. The soul of Cinder changed its movement once more, its attacks becoming wide, explosive, and familiar, mirroring the moves of the very first Lord of Sunlight. This was the trial of the last ember, where the atmosphere was one of rain of lightning and the roar of the sun. The warriors found that the manifestation was fighting with a tragic and desperate power, as if the fire itself was trying to protect its right to exist. The sound of the lightning striking the gray ground was a deep and final boom, making the crater feel like the inside of a dying star. This part of the history is a realization that the fire was no longer a grand light, but a tired and fading spark that had nothing left to give. The unkindled had to push through the storm of light, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the heat, a feeling of total and grounded focus as the manifestation finally dissolved into a pile of cold ash. With the guardian defeated, the journey led to the final choice for the future of the world. The unkindled stood before the tiny, flickering flame, the atmosphere quiet, heavy, and resolute. This is a story of the four paths, where the atmosphere is one of held breaths and the smell of the coming dark. The warrior could choose to link the fire, becoming the next sacrifice to keep the age of light going for a few more years. They could call the firekeeper to let the flame die, bringing on an age of dark and the quiet sleep of the world. Or they could usurp the flame, taking the power for themselves to lead an age of hollows. The sound of the fire crackling one last time was a soft and respectful note, signaling that the choice of the ash would change the nature of reality forever. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand reaching for the flame, realizing that the way of the soul had finally reached its ultimate and personal end. But before the world could end, a secret path led the unkindled away from the kiln and toward the high and windy peaks of Archdragon Peak. This was a hidden land of bright stone, ancient dragons, and the blue sky. The atmosphere was vast, silent, and ethereal, a realization that some things had remained untouched by the rot of the world. This part of the history is a story of the path of the dragon, where the atmosphere is one of clanging bells and the smell of ozone. You see the way the ancient serpent men guarded the path, their bodies long and scaled, as they moved with a rhythmic hiss. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of the high clouds. The sound of the massive bell ringing across the peak was a deep and final note, signaling that the Nameless King was coming to defend his mountain. The walk through the storm was a story of a forgotten god. The Unkindled moved onto a floor made of solid clouds to face the king who had once been the son of sunlight, but had chosen to side with the dragons. This is a moment of raw and elemental reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the Nameless King was a warrior of a different era. This part of the history is a story of the Stormborn, where the tradition of the dragon rider met the reality of the ash. The sound of the king's spear hitting the cloud was a sharp and piercing snap, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world of vapor and thunder. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their eyes fixed on the great bird of the storm, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the lightning and the sky. Deep in the heart of the storm, the final trial of the 9th part took place, as the Unkindled faced the Nameless King alone after his mount had fallen. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that this was the strongest warrior left in the world. This is a story of the sovereignty of the lightning spear, where the air was filled with the roar of the thunder and the hiss of the wind. The warriors found that the king moved with a steady and measured might, his attacks carrying the weight of the heavens. The sound of the spear thrusts was a sharp and echoing snap, signaling that the true enemy was the power of an age that had been forgotten by everyone else. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, his blade meeting the lightning, realizing that to truly end the cycle, he had to defeat the gods who had started it. The experience at the peak ends with the Unkindled standing over the body of the king, the storm finally clearing to reveal a quiet and empty mountain. The blue of the sky had led to a sovereignty of the gray ash falling from the clouds. They carried the weight of the dragon slayer's spirit and the silence of the peak. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path back to the end. The focus would now shift to the painted world of Ariandel and the freed scythe, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the rot into a world of frozen forests, Corvian settlements, and the realization that a new world needed to be painted. The final legacy of the 9th part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the final defiance. You have seen the ash break the soul of Cinder and the will of the Nameless King. You have felt the sting of the lightning and the weight of the choice. As the gold glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the peaks, and the first cold air of the end reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of the Unkindled finds its 9th and grounded resolution in the defeat of the gods, leaving behind the world of the kiln for a world of the snow, the painting, and a journey that was moving into the hidden corners of the world. The The entrance into the painted world of Ariandel was a journey from the world of grey ash into a landscape of endless snow, frozen pine, and the smell of cold rot. The air here was no longer thin like the kiln, but was heavy with frost and the scent of dying wood. This was a world inside a canvas, a sanctuary created for the lost and the forlorn who had no place in the world outside. The atmosphere was quiet, chilling, and filled with a sense of stagnation. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of deep, white snow that hid the jagged rocks and the bones of those who had frozen where they stood. The sound of the world was a low and constant whistle, the sound of the wind moving through the mountain passes and the rhythmic cawing of the crows in the distance. This part of the history is a story of the fatting canvas, a realization that even a world made of ink and prayer could not escape the cycle of the rot. As the unkindled moved through the frozen forests, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and predatory hunger. They found the Farron followers and the massive wolves of the woods, creatures that moved with a silent and lethal grace through the blizzard. This was the era of the cold hunt, where the atmosphere was one of blue shadows and the flash of steel. You see the way the wolves circled in the white mist, their eyes glowing with a wild and starving light. This part of the history is a story of the rotting sanctuary, a realization that the painting had stayed beautiful for too long and was now being consumed by a sickness that turned the flesh to gray slime. The sound of a wolf's howl was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the ice like a spear hitting a shield. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their blade cutting through the thick fur and the frozen wood, feeling the steady cold of the storm and the raw weight of the despair that filled the valley. Deep within the Corvian settlement, the atmosphere became cramped, sunken, and filled with the sound of weeping. The unkindled found a village of bird-like people who had given up on the light, choosing to rot in silence, rather than burn the world away to make room for a new one. This was the trial of the abject sorrow, where the atmosphere was one of dripping mud and the smell of old feathers. The warriors found that the village was being purged by the Knights of Freed, who used fire and claw to keep the inhabitants from seeking the flame. The sound of the Corvians' whispers was a low and musical note, making the narrow streets feel like the inside of a broken nest. This part of the history is a realization that the sister of the church, Freed, had convinced the father of the painting to hide the fire and let the world wither away. The unkindled had to push through the sludge and the filth, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the rot, a feeling of total and grounded focus as they climbed toward the great chapel on the hill. Inside the chapel of Ariandel, the atmosphere shifted to one of absolute and cold elegance. The unkindled found sister Freed sitting in a chair of stone, her blue robes and bare feet looking out of place in a world of such violence. This was the trial of the last protector, where the atmosphere was one of held breaths and the smell of cold sides. You see the way she spoke with a soft and respectful tone, asking the ash to leave the painting in peace. But the journey led to the basement of the chapel, where the father of the painting sat with a massive bowl of fire, his body bloated and chained to the floor. This part of the history is a story of the hidden ember, a realization that the fire needed to burn the painting away, so a new world could be painted with the dark soul of man. The sound of the father's roar was a deep and bone-shaking boom, signaling that the time of the cold was over. The battle that followed was a story of a threefold death. The unkindled had to face Freed alone, then Freed and the father together, and finally the black flame Freed as she rose from the dead one last time. This is a moment of raw and spiritual reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still between the bursts of black fire and ice. This part of the history is a story of the necessity of the burn, where the tradition of the protector met the reality of the savior. The sound of the scythes clashing against the stone was a sharp and ringing snap, making the chapel feel like the inside of a burning heart. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their boots sliding on the bloody ice, realizing that the way of the painting was now a path through the fire and the dark. Deep in the heart of the smoldering chapel, the final trial of the 10th part took place as the unkindled watched the painting begin to burn. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that the rot was finally being cleansed. This is a story of the sovereignty of the new canvas, where the young painter girl sat in the attic, waiting for the pigment of the dark soul to begin her work. The conversation was short and focused on the coming world that would be cold, dark, and very gentle. The sound of the fire eating the wood of the chapel was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the old dreams were finally being let go. John stood in the smoke, his eyes fixed on the girl, realizing that to finish her painting, he had to travel to the end of the world to find the blood of the pygmy lords. The experience in Ariandel ends with the unkindled standing at the edge of a new bonfire that led to the Dreg Heap. The white of the snow had led to a sovereignty of the sunken cities at the bottom of the world. They carried the weight of the Father's flame and the silence of the Freed's end. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the ringed city. The focus would now shift to the Dreg Heap and the Demon Prince, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the gravity into a world of falling towers, angelic shadows, and the realization that all cities were becoming one. The final legacy of the 10th part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the cleansing fire. You have seen the ash break the will of Freed and the silence of the painting. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the scythe. As the orange glow of the burning chapel faded into the shadows of the attic, and the first warm air of the fire reached the painter, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of the unkindled finds its 10th and grounded resolution in the burning of Ariandel, leaving behind the world of the ice for a world of the ruins. the dregs, and a journey that was moving into the final city of the first man. The descent into the dreg heap was a journey into the final graveyard of every kingdom that had ever existed. This was the bottom of the world, where the very fabric of reality had collapsed under the weight of the fatting fire. The air here was no longer filled with the crisp scent of the painting, but was heavy, thick, and smelling of ancient dust and sunken stone. This was a place where Lothric, Anor Londo, and the desert lands of the south had all crashed together in a twisted pile of rubble. The atmosphere was quiet, oppressive, and filled with the sound of shifting earth. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a treacherous path of crumbling towers and ash-covered rooftops that leaned into a bottomless gray void. The sound of the world was a low and constant grinding, the sound of stone sliding against stone as the world continued to sink. This part of the history is a story of the final compression, a realization that time and space had finally run out of room. As the unkindled moved through the ruins of an old cathedral, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and aerial dread. They found themselves hunted by angels of the dregs, golden winged spirits that rained down beams of piercing light from the high clouds. This was the era of the falling towers, where the atmosphere was one of frantic hiding and the smell of burning ash. You see the way the beams of light turned the gray dust into molten glass with every strike. This part of the history is a story of the last watchers of the sky, a realization that the heavens themselves were becoming hostile as the light died. The sound of the light hitting the stone was a sharp and searing note, a noise that echoed across the ruins like a whip cracking in the dark. The unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, diving behind broken walls and sliding down mounds of ash, feeling the steady heat of the beams and the raw weight of the gravity that pulled everything downward. Deep within the earthen peak of a forgotten land, the atmosphere became cramped, poisonous, and filled with the sound of churning mud. The unkindled found a vast swamp of dull purple sludge, where the ruins of the desert kingdom had come to rest. This was the trial of the sunken desert, where the atmosphere was one of bubbling gas and the hiss of ancient insects. The warriors found that the land was being guarded by the desert pyromancer Zoe, who used the last flickers of the chaos fire to defend the path. The sound of the fire hitting the wet mud was a sharp and hissing note, making the ruins feel like the inside of a boiling pot. This part of the history is a realization that even at the end of the world, the old rivalries were still being fought in the dirt. The unkindled had to push through the thick, toxic air, feeling the steady pulse in their wrist and the constant pressure of the poison, a feeling of total and grounded focus as they reached the edge of a massive, dark pit. Inside the pit, at the very base of the world, the atmosphere shifted to one of ancient and smoldering fire. The unkindled found the demon prince, the last of a dying race that had once been born from the chaos flame. This was the trial of the last of the chaos, where the atmosphere was one of roaring flames and the smell of sulfur. You see the way the two smaller demons merged into one colossal winged nightmare that filled the cavern with explosive light and black smoke. This part of the history is a story of the extinction of a species, a realization that by killing the prince, the Unkindled was ending a bloodline that had lasted since the beginning of time. The sound of the demon's wings beating against the air was a deep and final thrum, signaling that the fire of the earth was making its final stand. John moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade cutting through the crystallized fire and the leathery skin, realizing that the way of the ash required the death of the old world's demons. The walk through the cave behind the demon's throne was a story of a sacred discovery. The Unkindled found a small stone pedestal overlooking a hidden valley that was untouched by the gray ruins above. This is a moment of raw and visual reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the ringed city was still standing behind a veil of ancient illusion. This part of the history is a story of the hidden gift of the gods, where the tradition of the seal met the reality of the preservation. The sound of the wind moving through the valley below was a soft and musical note, making the warriors feel solid and heavy in a world that was perfect and untouched. They moved with a sturdy and measured might, their eyes fixed on the green trees and silver spires of the city, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path into the prison of the first men. Deep in the heart of the city walls, the final trial of the 11th part took place as the Unkindled faced the Judicator Giant and his army of phantom archers. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the Pygmy Lords did not want to be found. This is a story of the sovereignty of the sealed city, where the air was filled with the hiss of 1,000 spectral arrows, appearing and vanishing in an instant. The warriors found that the city was a golden cage built by the gods to keep the humans and their dark soul away from the rest of the world. The sound of the arrows hitting the stone was a sharp and ringing snap, signaling that the true enemy was the fear that the gods had for the coming of man. John moved with a sturdy and measured power, his shield held against the ghostlight, realizing that to get the blood for the painting, he had to break the seal of the city. The experience at the ringed city ends with the Unkindled standing at the top of a long stone staircase that led down into the heart of the streets. The gray of the dregs had led to a sovereignty of the purple flowers and the sunlight of the past. They carried the weight of the demon's end and the silence of the ancient walls. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the origin of the dark. The focus would now shift to the spears of the church and the slave nightingale, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the pigment into a world of abyssal swamps, sleeping princesses, and the realization that the end was a desert of red sand. The final legacy of the 11th part of the fatting is a story of the strength in the final descent. You have seen the ash break the will of the demons and the silence of the dreg heap. you have felt the sting of the light and the weight of the ruins. As the orange glow of the demon's fire faded into the shadows of the city, and the first warm air of the valley reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of the Unkindled finds its 11th and grounded resolution in the reaching of the ringed city, leaving behind the world of the collapse for a world of the secret, the dark, and a journey that was moving into the final act of the human soul. The entrance into the final heart of the ringed city was a journey into a world where the sun hung low and static, a pale and bleeding circle that cast no warmth. The air here was no longer the scent of the valley, but was heavy, thick, and smelling of ancient parchment and the deep water. This was the end of the road, the place where the gods had hidden the pygmy lords and the essence of the human soul. The atmosphere was quiet, ethereal, and filled with a sense of infinite waiting. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of white stone and purple flowers that seemed to glow with a faint, dying light. The sound of the world was a low and constant thrum, the sound of the city's heart beating its final, slow rhythm. This part of the history is a story of the final secret, a realization that the entire city was a beautiful lie designed to keep the world from moving forward. As the Unkindled moved toward the lowest reaches of the city, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and primordial terror. They found the Dark Eater Midir, a colossal dragon of the abyss who had spent eternity consuming the darkness to keep it from the world. This was the era of the abyssal scales, where the atmosphere was one of purple fire and the smell of deep water. You see the way the dragon breathed a beam of concentrated dark that tore the stone apart like paper. This part of the history is a story of the eternal guardian, a realization that the dragon had stayed true to its duty, even as the gods who gave it the task had all died. The sound of Midir's roar was a deep and bone-shaking boom, a noise that echoed across the chasm like the cracking of the earth. The Unkindled moved with a sturdy and measured might, their blade cutting through the stone-like hide, feeling the steady cold of the dark and the raw weight of the ancient war as they finally allowed the dragon to rest. Deep within the church at the top of the hill, the atmosphere became cramped, sacred, and filled with a fragile grace. The Unkindled found the Princess Filianor, daughter of the First Lord, who lay sleeping while clutching a cracked and empty egg. This was the trial of the last illusion, where the atmosphere was one of soft light and the smell of dust. The warriors found that the princess's sleep was what held the city together, keeping the ravages of time from reaching the walls. The sound of the egg breaking as the Unkindled touched it was a sharp and piercing note, making the world feel like it was shattering like glass. This part of the history is a realization that by waking the princess, the Unkindled was ending the dream of the gods. The world instantly dissolved into a vast and infinite desert of red sand, where the city was nothing but a skeleton in the wind. The walk through the red desert was a story of the end of all things. The Unkindled moved through the ruins of the world to find a lone figure crawling through the sand, eating the flesh of the pygmy lords. This was Slave Night Gale, the warrior who had been searching for the blood of the dark soul to give to the painter girl. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating with the blowing sand. This was the trial of the Red Hood, where the atmosphere became one of whistling steel and the spray of blood. You see the way Gale moved with a savage and bestial speed, his cloak flapping like tattered wings in the storm. The sound of his heavy blade hitting the sand was a dull and final thud, signaling that the long search had turned him into a monster. This part of the history is a realization that Gale had sacrificed his own sanity to gather the soul in his own blood, knowing he would never live to see the new world. The battle that followed was a story of two ash seekers at the edge of time. The Unkindled and Gale fought as the lightning struck the sand and the sky turned to black. This is a moment of raw and existential reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still between the bursts of rapid strikes and dark miracles. This part of the history is a story of the final duel for the future, where the tradition of the slave met the reality of the champion. The sound of the blades clashing was a sharp and ringing snap, making the desert feel like the inside of a final heartbeat. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, their boots heavy in the red dust, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the blood and the ash. Deep in the heart of the desert, the final trial of the 12th part took place as Gale finally fell, his blood turning into the pigment needed for the painting. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the dark soul was finally ready. This is a story of the sovereignty of the final gift, where the Unkindled took the blood of the dark soul back to the painted world of Ariandel. The conversation with the painter girl was short and focused on the new world she would create. The sound of her brush hitting the canvas was a soft and respectful note, signaling that the old world could finally be let go. John stood in the attic, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the scent of the fire, realizing that the only way to save the world was to build a new one that would never know the rot. The experience at the end of the world ends with the Unkindled standing in the quiet and burning attic, looking at the beginning of the new painting. The gray of the ash had led to a sovereignty of the gentle dark. They carried the weight of the Gale's sacrifice and the silence of the dead gods. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the gentle night. The focus would now shift to the eternal sleep, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the ink into a world of cold and gentle peace. The final legacy of the 12 parts of the fatting is a story of the strength in the final piece. You have seen the ash break the illusion of the gods and the will of the night. You have felt the sting of the sand and the weight of the blood. As the orange glow of the burning world faded into the shadows of the new canvas, and the first cool air of the new painting reached the room, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of the Unkindled finds its 12th and grounded resolution in the gift of the dark soul, leaving behind the world of the fire for a world of the painting, the peace, and a journey that had finally reached its ultimate and silent conclusion.